After the big success that was Yakuza 4's launch, the team at Sega once again quickly got to work on making a follow-up. But this new title likely wouldn't end up being what fans of the series were expecting it would be. The game was first announced in June of 2010 during an interview with series producer Toshihiro Nagoshi. During this interview, he would casually mention that the next game was not only in development, but that it would star fan-favorite character Goro Majima as a playable character for the first time in the series. A trailer would then be shown at Tokyo Game Show 2010, where fans would see the district of Kamurocho being overrun by zombies and other large monsters, officially revealing to the world that this would be a zombie-based spin-off called Ryuga Gotoku of the End, or Yakuza Dead Souls in the international releases. Fans of the series were a little mixed on the premise, to say the least, which is very clearly reflected in the sales figures for the game, with Dead Souls selling a little over 500,000 copies worldwide in its first year, compared to the nearly 400,000 copies that Yakuza 4 had sold in its first week. The game would go on to develop a bit of a reputation within the Yakuza community as somewhat of a black sheep, and a spin-off that just no one really wanted. But over these last couple weeks, I've taken the time to sit down with the game and give it a real honest try, and I've certainly come away from that experience with a lot of thoughts. So join me as we take a serious look at that one time that they put zombies in a Yakuza game. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 7th in a series of videos where I'm playing every game in the Yakuza series for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. You don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, but you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games and my thoughts on them if you haven't seen them. Plus, if you're not overly familiar with any of those earlier entries, it might be nice to go back and get caught up on those so that you can get the complete story out of the series. So for those that are interested, I'll have the full playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Yakuza Dead Souls is an action-adventure game developed and published by Sega for the PlayStation 3 in 2011. The game opens roughly 1 year after the events of Yakuza 4, with returning protagonist Shun Akiyama going out for some collections just like any other day. But given the nature of what this spin-off is, his workday is cut short when a sudden zombie outbreak starts to spread throughout Kamurocho. From here, the typical Yakuza plot that we've grown accustomed to gets completely thrown out the window, and things boil down to basic survival. Not to say that there isn't an interesting story here, because there definitely is. While things start out very simple, there are little bits of intrigue scattered throughout the early parts of the game, not so subtly hinting at the possibility that the zombies and other creatures running around the city were actually created intentionally for some larger purpose. But we'll come back to that a bit later. Structurally, the game was actually very different from what I had expected going in, as it basically uses the exact same blueprint that Yakuza 4 did. We get 4 different playable characters here, with each of them getting exactly 4 story chapters dedicated to just them, before one final chapter at the end to cap off the story as a whole. The first of these characters, as I just mentioned, is Shun Akiyama from Yakuza 4. Akiyama definitely gets the simplest part of the story here, with him simply trying to keep himself and his personal assistant safe from the zombies before any of that larger intrigue really gets introduced. After his chapters though, we get those of the other character I've already mentioned, my favorite recurring character in the series, Goro Majima. Majima, being the slightly psychopathic sadist that he is actually thrilled by the sudden zombie outbreak, and takes the opportunity to grab his favorite shotgun and go out for some good old-fashioned zombie hunting. However, his fun is unfortunately interrupted when he runs into Daigo Dojima and is given the duty of protecting all the civilians that are stuck inside of Kamurocho Hills. But he still gets to shoot zombies while doing so thankfully, it's not too much of a rain on his parade. The third character we get to play as here is returning antagonist now turned protagonist Ryuji Goda. In this non-canon timeline of the Yakuza series, everything from the first 4 mainline games played out pretty much exactly the same as what we saw, with one of the very few differences being that Ryuji actually survived his fight with Kiryu from the end of Yakuza 2. In the years since, he was thrown out of the Omi Alliance as punishment for his attempted takeover, and actually gave up on Yakuza life entirely as a result. But when he hears rumors that some of his old friends from his past might have something to do with the zombie outbreak in Kamurocho, he quickly travels to Tokyo to find out if what he's hearing is true. And last but not least, as if I even have to tell you who it is, our fourth character here is the main character of the entire series, Kazuma Kiryu. Kiryu is living his life in Okinawa as usual until he randomly receives a phone call from someone in Kamurocho telling him that they've kidnapped Haruka, and that if Kiryu wants her to be returned safely, he'll have to travel up to Kamurocho and meet them in person. So of course, Kiryu shows up in Kamurocho not long after to seek out Haruka's kidnappers and ultimately get to the bottom of who exactly is behind what's happening to the city. Much like what we saw back in Yakuza 4, each of our main characters here have a believable reason for getting involved in the story, and they all end up crossing paths at certain parts of the story. Unlike Yakuza 4 though, we actually don't get a big finale where all four of them come together, as the most of them that we ever see in one room throughout the entire story is 3 of them. This makes the finale a lot less satisfying than the one in Yakuza 4 was, though let's be honest, it's kind of hard to compete in that regard. But in exchange for this, we actually get much more frequent overlap between the characters throughout the early and middle portions of the game, which feels a lot more natural than Yakuza 4's keep them all separate until the final quarter of the game approach. So while we don't get quite the big finale that we did in 4, we get a lot more of those little moments with things like Majima meeting Akiyama for the first time, Majima and Kiryu fighting zombies together, Kiryu and Akiyama having a reunion after not seeing each other since the events of Yakuza 4, just smaller things like that. It makes the overall narrative here feel a lot more natural, since the characters aren't being intentionally separated throughout the game like they were in the last one using this formula. And outside of that, I think most of us could agree that the best parts of Yakuza 4's story were when all the characters would come together, so this just gives us a lot more of those awesome moments. That's about all I've got on the story until the spoiler section though, so let's finally talk a bit about what it's like to actually play Dead Souls. There's an insane amount of interesting things to talk about here, so much so that it actually made formatting this video a bit of a nightmare, but I think that we definitely have to start with the core combat of the game. This is one of the largest departures of Dead Souls, as the fluid beat-em-up combat that the series has used up to this point is just completely absent here. In its place, we now have some very run-and-gun style third-person shooting. The game uses genuine auto-aim for the shooting here, with players simply needing to have a zombie on screen and have their character facing the general direction of said enemy in order to shoot them. So all you have to do is pretty much just run around and spam the fire button, and you'll land almost every single one of your shots on one of the various zombies on the screen. That being said though, you can actually do some more traditional over-the-shoulder aiming by holding L2, but doing so will lock you in place, and the aiming controls are pretty terrible. The camera sensitivity here is way too high, there's some crazy aim acceleration that kicks in if you do anything more than basically just tap the thumbstick, and there's no way to adjust any of these settings in the game's settings, so what you see here is what you get. This means that your best strategy here is to just stick to the auto-aiming while running around, or at the absolute most, using the half-aiming state that you can activate by holding L1. This is the best middle ground between accuracy and movement because it zooms in the camera just a bit and lets you aim with the right thumbstick, but still uses the auto-aim. And while it does slow you down to a walking speed while using it, you can at least still move compared to the actual over-the-shoulder aim. Poor aiming controls aside though, the combat here weirdly isn't that bad. Now I know, you're looking at this and hearing me say that it's not that bad and you're thinking to yourself, what the hell is this guy on? This looks awful. But seriously you guys, when I looked at gameplay of this game before actually playing it for myself, I also thought that it looked pretty terrible. But actually playing it feels oddly satisfying. And while the general beat-em-up combat might be gone, a lot of elements from that combat have actually been carried over, like the quick dodge mechanics and the ability to pick up various weapons from the environment and use them against the zombies. Additionally, there's a kick move here that can be used as a sort of shove mechanic, just to give you a little something extra to keep the zombies off of you. I never really used the kick outside of the tutorial for it because why would I when I already have a shotgun in my hand, but it's there and does make things feel at least a little more like a traditional Yakuza game. Now, what you might be noticing in these clips here is that the camera in this game is really bad. Like, seriously, one of the worst that I've had to deal with in a game in a very long time. It works fine in the general city street areas, but as soon as you're in any sort of more cramped space, or especially whenever you're indoors, it is awful. This is because of a combination of two things. First, there's the camera sensitivity issue that I already mentioned, which just makes angling the camera properly in these tighter spaces a massive pain. Second, and more importantly, is that the field of view of the camera doesn't get any tighter in indoor spaces, nor does it draw itself any closer to the player character. It can move itself closer to the player character if there's a wall in the way, or if you hold down L1 to enter that sort of half-aiming state. But outside of those two conditions, you'll get the same zoomed out camera that you have in the streets, just wildly swinging around while you're trying to fight zombies in an enclosed space. This means that when you're in those interior spaces, you have two options available to you. You either sit there and painfully fight against the camera to be able to see anything, or you just accept your fate and start firing in all directions wildly while praying that you'll make it out alive. Even after I was like 20 plus hours into the game, I was still struggling with the camera. So while the general controls are something that you can definitely get used to here, the camera will just always be terrible no matter how much experience you have fighting against it. Moving on to something a little more positive though, the game has a large variety of different weapons to play around with. You'll always want to have a pistol on hand, since every pistol in the game is blessed with the gift of infinite ammo, but outside of those you've got shotguns, submachine guns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, Gatling guns, just about anything you could possibly want in a zombie shooter. You can have 4 different weapons equipped at any given time, and each of them will be bound to one of the buttons on the D-pad, allowing you to quickly swap between them to deal with whatever situation you might find yourself in. And to match the variety in the weapons, there's also a great variety in different enemy types. At the start of the game, you'll be put up against nothing but the basic zombie. But as you progress, the game will slowly introduce more and more mutants that each have their own unique behaviors as well as strengths and weaknesses. Some of them will need to be approached in very specific ways to deal with, like the meatheads who can only be damaged by shooting them in the face, which forces you to actually lock yourself in place and manually aim at them to take them down. The pace at which they introduce these mutants is also really good, as you'll run into a new one every 1 or 2 story chapters, pretty much all the way through the end of the game, with some of the most dangerous enemies in the game being reserved for just the last few story chapters. Slowly introducing the enemies like this ensures that the player is always having new obstacles thrown at them in combat pretty much the whole way through, which does a good job at keeping things surprisingly fresh here when it comes to the shooting, even if it is just a select handful of enemies. And while the heat system has technically been removed here, it's more accurate to say that it's been repurposed. See, in Dead Souls, we don't have a heat gauge, but we do have a snipe gauge. This gauge will fill as you deal damage to enemies, rapidly deplete if you take damage, and can even slowly regenerate over time if you unlock certain skills throughout your playthrough. Once it's charged up to a minimum threshold, you can then cash in your snipe gauge in exchange for these really big and flashy attacks that do way more damage than just shooting the zombies like normal. But obviously we aren't going up and grabbing the zombies to initiate these attacks, since the whole point of using guns in the first place is to keep our distance from them and not get bit. So instead, there will be certain objects in the environment that can be targeted to use a snipe gauge attack. These can be as simple as just sniping an explosive barrel to take out a large group, or as fun and creative as shooting the cap off of a fire hydrant and letting the blast of water sweep away a horde of zombies. And on top of that, you get things like tandem moves with your allies from time to time, with things like them throwing a handful of grenades towards the zombie horde and allowing you to snipe them out of the air to blow them all away. And then there's my favorite use for the snipe gauge, that being that it can be used for counterattacks against some of the stronger mutants you'll face. If you're quick enough on the draw, you can straight up interrupt some of the strongest attacks in the game with these, while also dealing a large chunk of damage back to that enemy, which makes the combat against these stronger enemies feel much more dynamic when compared to gunning down your generic zombie hordes. So yeah, the snipe gauge is, for all intents and purposes, just the heat gauge reskinned and repurposed to fit the new combat formula. That being said though, it does feel like a very natural fit, and since the heat system has always been great since the original game, there really wasn't any reason for them to change it more than they needed to. The cherry on top though is that the boss fights in Dead Souls are shockingly good. There are all sorts of crazy bosses that you'll fight throughout the main story chapters, and each of them have their own varied mechanics that force you to change up your approach not just from one boss to another, but also across each of the many phases that each of them have. Additionally, most of them have some more of that fun counterplay using the snipe gauge, which makes things feel more like an active back and forth between the two of you. Some of these fights are pretty awesome spectacles as well, which just seals the deal and makes them even more fun and memorable than they otherwise would have been. So weirdly, despite the fact that the Yakuza series has historically struggled with boss fights up to this point, the bosses in Dead Souls are mostly a ton of fun. As to be expected, there are a couple stinkers in here, but I would genuinely say that most of them are actively good fights. As interesting as the combat of Dead Souls is though, I wouldn't say that it's anywhere near as interesting as the game's approach to the open world and player progression. See, what might surprise most of you who aren't familiar with the game is that the zombie outbreak in Kamurocho doesn't immediately overrun the entire city. When it first hits, it actually only ends up overrunning Tenkaichi Street and Theater Square, as the military is able to get those areas quarantined off before it spreads any further. And outside of the quarantine zone, life in Kamurocho goes on just like usual. You're still able to go out on a casual stroll around the town, stop in at various businesses, and meet NPCs that will give you side quests just like you can in any other Yakuza game. The team has once again reused the same Kamurocho map that they had in Yakuza 3 and 4, but the underground areas from 4 have been repurposed here and now act as connecting points to move between the quarantine zone and the normal open world. So while you'll be fighting off hordes of zombies within the quarantine zone, you also just have a totally normal Yakuza game outside of it, and you can move between the two at will using the underground tunnels. As you progress through the main story though, the quarantine zone will slowly expand as the zombies break through the military's defenses. And while they may still be using the same Kamurocho map that we've been running around since Yakuza 3, the areas inside of the quarantine zone are completely transformed by the infection and the destruction that comes along with it. Now, admittedly, I do have a bit of a personal soft spot for zombie media, but I thought it was super fun to watch the Kamurocho that we've come to know and love slowly be overrun and destroyed by the zombie infection. But don't worry about potentially missing out on things like minigame or restaurant completion because of the outbreak, because anytime that an establishment becomes part of the quarantine zone, you'll actually be able to fight your way over to it and clear out the zombies attacking it. Doing so will allow the survivors inside to safely keep the business running, ensuring that even though the bowling alley will be overrun by the time you reach Majima's chapters, you'll still be able to take our favorite maniac out for a few frames. And speaking of minigames, this is one of the areas where I felt the most disappointed by Dead Souls. That's because the minigames here are all just the same ones that we had in Yakuza 4. That's not an exaggeration either. Every single minigame from Yakuza 4 is here, with not a single new minigame on offer. I mean seriously, the only meaningful updates to the minigames here are that the models for the hostesses and the massage girl have been changed compared to Yakuza 4. Outside of that, everything is exactly the same, and all of this footage that I have might as well just be from my Yakuza 4 playthrough. It actually led to me not spending much time during my playthrough playing minigames, because it just didn't feel like there was anything new or exciting for me to engage with here compared to the previous titles. Something that I spent plenty of time doing though was completing the various sub-stories of Dead Souls. And that's because the sub-stories here are just as good, if not even better than those found in Yakuza 4. They of course have that trademark variety and personality that we've come to know Yakuza sub-stories for, but on top of that, the majority of them are actually fully voice acted this time. This is a first for the series, and makes it a lot easier to sit down and just go check out the various sub-stories available to you for long periods of time, as the voice acting makes the extensive dialogue exchanges much more stimulating than they have been in the previous Yakuza titles. It even extends beyond the general text box conversations as well, as if you're ever moving through the quarantine zone alongside a sub-story NPC, they and your partner will frequently have conversations to fill the time while moving from point A to point B. It almost feels very similar to how like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption will have conversations while driving or riding on horseback just to fill the travel time. And the sub-stories are also very directly tied to the new partner system that Dead Souls brings to the table. If you meet the right conditions during certain sub-stories, an NPC from said sub-story might feel so indebted to you that they become available as a partner from that point on. This means that anytime you're going into the quarantine zone, you'll be able to go in alone like usual, or choose to bring that new partner in with you to double your effective fighting power against the zombies. This makes the sub-stories the first in a series of new open world features in Dead Souls that offer players fun and engaging activities in exchange for long-term progression rewards, making them not only entertaining, but also incredibly worthwhile to seek out and complete. Something else that I spent plenty of time engaging with here was the training. Contrary to Yakuza 4, where every character had their own master to go and train with, Dead Souls only has one master that everyone will train under. But that one master just so happens to be the one and only Gary Buster Holmes. He shows up out of nowhere in full militaristic garb to offer us an exclusive spot in his shooting range training program. Because we use guns for the combat here. And, you know, he's American. He has a couple of different course types on offer here, with both of them having several difficulty levels for players to move through. Completing his courses with high letter grades will then allow you to take an exam with Gary, and if you can pass, you'll unlock higher difficulty levels as well as occasionally learn some new skills that you can only earn by training with him. Some of these can be really frustrating thanks to the game's poor aiming controls, but I stuck through it just to unlock all of the skills from Gary's training, and if I can do it, you guys probably could too. It's a fun way to carry over the Yakuza series' iconic training formula to a game that no longer uses hand-to-hand combat, and it works fairly well all things considered. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering how only having one training master for all 4 characters actually works, since in Yakuza 4, the progression and abilities of each character were all completely separate. And that brings us to one of the most interesting changes about Dead Souls, that being that all of your levels, experience, items, and weapons will be carried over from character to character this time. So when you finish Akiyama's chapters and go into Majima's, you don't actually lose any of your progress. Every ability and item that you've earned up to that point will simply still be available once you swap over to Majima. This was likely done just because the characters don't have unique movesets and playstyles this time around, with the designers opting to give them all their own signature weapons instead. These signature weapons are the only items in the game that can't be carried over between characters, as each of the 4's unique weapons end up being the best in their class, which does somewhat define a unique playstyle, just to a much lesser degree than what we saw in Yakuza 4. Akiyama gets a pair of dual pistols, Majima gets a semi-automatic shotgun, Ryuji has a quad-barreled Gatling gun built into his prosthetic arm, and Kiryu gets a 50 caliber sniper rifle. So the playstyles are nowhere near as unique as they were in Yakuza 4, but having the progression carry over between characters does make spending time on side activities feel so much more valuable than they did in that game. So it's a bit of a trade-off in that sense, and I feel like for a lot of people, this will be a matter of personal preference. Leveling up your characters also functions the exact same way it did in Yakuza 4, with levels simply increasing your maximum health value, as well as giving you a certain number of soul orbs that can then be spent on unlocking skills in whichever order you please. One new thing though is that while you're playing through the main story chapters, you'll actually get a letter grade based on your performance in each level. The higher the letter grade you get, the larger the XP bonus you'll be given as a result. So if you're playing well during the main story, you'll level up and unlock new skills faster than you would otherwise. There are some other interesting changes here, like them tying your maximum inventory space into a skill that you have to purchase with soul orbs, but in terms of the leveling and unlocking new skills, there isn't really a whole lot new to talk about here. But my favorite part of Dead Souls' progression is the return of one of my favorite systems from one of my favorite Yakuza games. That being the weapon modding system, which is much closer here to the swordsmithing system from Kenzan than it is to the weapon modding systems of Yakuza 3 or 4. The main reason for this is that unlike Y3 or 4, your weapons are back to being your primary source of damage like they were in Kenzan. So when you save up enough money and go find enough of the crafting materials that you need to upgrade your favorite gun, that's a permanent upgrade to your damage output rather than an upgrade to a weapon that will break in like 50 hits. The crafting materials are most commonly found by just killing zombies, as every enemy in the game has a small chance to drop you one, which is also very similar to how Kenzan's enemies would drop crafting materials when defeated in combat. However, some of the more rare materials can only be found as rewards from sub-stories, or from the final new progression system that I haven't talked about yet. Pretty much as soon as the open world becomes available, players will be approached by a mysterious woman in a lab coat who offers to reward us for sending her data on the zombies. And what better way to gather data on the zombies than by killing thousands of them, sometimes in incredibly specific ways according to whatever she requests from you. These challenges are known as directives, and completing them while playing through the rest of the game will reward you with points that you can then use to exchange for rare items, including some of those more elusive crafting materials. But in the event that you go to meet the woman in person, she'll ask you to go to a specific location for her and complete a challenge in exchange for a large point bonus. These might have you doing things like going down into the tunnels and incinerating hundreds of zombies in one go, or being locked in a room with a group of the most dangerous mutants in the game and nothing but a pistol to defeat them with. These more direct challenges from her are known as Spec Ops, and I really enjoyed their addition, even if you only get 2 or 3 of them to complete per character. The way that these challenges directly tie into the weapon system and reward you with permanent power increases for completing them is really satisfying, and made them one of my favorite parts of the game, even though I don't think they would work very well in the other mainline Yakuza titles. Maybe they could with some tweaking, but the system is clearly made for a game where you'll be killing thousands upon thousands of zombies throughout your playthrough, so putting them into a game where you only fight a few hundred enemies over the course of a full playthrough just probably wouldn't work out quite as well. Now, I saved this part for after the gameplay discussion because I think it's a much less meaningful component of the discussion about Dead Souls, but I think it's worth talking about the game's presentation at least a little bit. I already mentioned that I found watching the zombies slowly overrun Kamurocho and change its appearance as they do to be really fun, and similarly, I loved seeing a bunch of the recognizable character models from Yakuza 3 and 4 get turned into zombies here. But it's definitely worth noting that the graphics of Dead Souls look a bit dated for when it came out. This is mainly because of 2 things. The first is that the game the engine is running on is still the Kenzan engine, meaning it hasn't really seen any updates since that game's development back in 2006 and 2007. This would be fine on its own, but then there's the second factor, that being that most of the assets they're using in this game are still being reused from Yakuza 3. Now, I should emphasize here that I have no issue with developers reusing assets, especially when it allows them to pump out high quality and totally unique experiences as quickly as the team at Sega has always done with the Yakuza franchise. But when you go multiple years without meaningfully updating either your engine or your assets, during a period in gaming history where we were seeing some of the most rapid developments in video game graphics ever, your game is going to start to look a bit dated compared to its contemporaries. Again, I don't think the somewhat dated visuals of Dead Souls end up dragging the experience down by much, primarily because the overall experience is just so unique compared to the rest of the Yakuza series. But in a series like this where I'm going through and evaluating every single game in the franchise in release order, I thought it would be worth noting, both to compare it to the games that we've already covered, and also so that we can come back to this idea in later videos, whether that be in a positive or a negative light. But now that we've covered basically everything I wanted to with the gameplay, let's dive a bit deeper into the story. I'm going to be seriously spoiling Dead Souls' story in this section, so if you plan on playing it for yourself and want to avoid spoilers, skip to the timestamp on screen. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, the early parts of the story are incredibly simple, with them really just being about Akiyama trying to survive the outbreak. But at the very end of Akiyama's chapters, you'll get a boss fight against a very evolved mutant, only to then realize after you've killed it that there's some sort of metallic device in its skin with a barcode tattooed right next to it. This, and other initial hints at the fact that someone might have actually been behind the infection, are super fun and genuinely really interesting, though that could just be my inner Resident Evil fan talking. Moving into Majima's chapters, we end up hearing from some other Tojo members that they think the Omi Alliance might have had something to do with the zombies, as Ryuji Goto was seen hanging around in Kamurocho shortly before the outbreak, along with another known member of the Omi Alliance named Tetsuo Nikaido. This makes those earlier hints even more interesting, as it now seems like this might have actually been a targeted attack on the Tojo that got out of control, especially since the initial outbreak starts with a lone zombie wandering into a Tojo clan office. Majima and Daigo manage to set up a call with Omi Alliance leadership thanks to some help from the florist, but the Omi completely deny any involvement with the outbreak. They remind Daigo that Ryuji is no longer affiliated with the Omi and hasn't been for years, meaning their only remaining hope to find out what's going on would be to find Ryuji or Nikaido themselves. Shortly after this, Majima and Akiyama manage to find Nikaido hanging around the batting cages, and while they don't outright confirm that he's behind everything here, a giant mutant does drop down from the ceiling to try to kill them, and Nikaido makes a comment about how he made sure they'd be entertained before disappearing, basically confirming that he is behind the outbreak. But once we get into Ryuji's portion of the story, we learn in a flashback that Nikaido had approached him while he was trying to live an honest life in Tokyo, offering Ryuji revenge on the Tojo clan. Ryuji turned him down, however, reminding him that he's given up on that life and doesn't feel the need to get involved again. But once the outbreak started, Ryuji became worried that his old friend Tetsuo had gotten himself involved in something far too dangerous, so he returned to Kamurocho to search for him and try to get to the bottom of what happened. While visiting a Tojo office to tell them that he suspects Tetsuo, the office is suddenly attacked by the same lone zombie that we saw in the initial outbreak, whom Ryuji recognizes as Hayashi. And yes, Hayashi, as in that one Omi lieutenant who we fought a couple times back in Yakuza 1 and 2. Bringing back this random side character who would likely be interested in getting revenge on the Tojo as a sort of patient zero super spreader for a zombie story like this is a really fun idea, and honestly, his recurring appearances throughout the game ended up being some of my favorite moments in Dead Souls. At the end of Ryuji's story though, there's a sudden meeting with Nikaido where he outright tells Ryuji that he is in fact the one responsible for unleashing the zombie virus on the city, and also throws out this total ass-pull reveal that he's kidnapped Haruka in an attempt to get Kiryu to show up in Kamurocho. Once Kiryu does inevitably show up to confront Nikaido, we learn that his entire reason for doing all this was to get revenge on Kiryu, specifically for the shame that he brought to Ryuji Goto when defeating him at the end of Yakuza 2. He explains that Ryuji was the man he respected and looked up to more than anyone else, so seeing Kiryu put him to shame the way he did angered him so much that he knew he needed revenge on Kiryu. So to do this, he engineered and released a zombie virus in Tokyo that killed the majority of the civilian population, kidnapped Kiryu's adoptive daughter, and lured him to Tokyo so that he would be killed by the zombies. Now, if that sounds incredibly stupid to you, that's because it is. And look, I get that having some sort of larger plot in a Yakuza game about zombies was going to be really difficult to pull off, but I genuinely felt like all the mystery and buildup throughout most of the story was handled really well. However, by the time that Ryuji and Nikaido had their confrontation and Haruka and Kiryu were brought into the story, it kind of just all fell apart and felt really dumb. The worst part is, there's really not much to talk about outside of that central plot, because I might as well have just summarized the entire story for you. Everything outside of that is just a small series of typical zombie media tropes, but with a bit of a Yakuza-themed spin on them. And while these do make the overall story feel really fun when you're playing through it, they don't really add to a more satisfying central plotline. So at the end of the day, if you're someone who plays the Yakuza games for the story, I could totally recommend Dead Souls if you're just there for the fun and for the journey. But if you're looking for an actual smart and well put together story, I definitely can't tell you that Dead Souls is going to be that. All things considered though, I genuinely had a lot of fun with my time in Dead Souls. It has plenty of issues with things like the story or the terrible controls that make playing the game way more painful than it should be, but there are so many cool ideas here, and seeing all of our favorite characters from the Yakuza series in a zombie outbreak is just way more fun than it honestly should be. It's a game with plenty of flaws and a lot of things that absolutely could have been handled better, but the sheer fun factor of it makes it a very hard game for me to dislike. Plus, I mean, come on guys, it was the first time we ever got a playable Majima in the series, it's still the only time we ever got a playable Ryuji in the series, and it has Akiyama again, so it's clearly an S-tier Yakuza game. While I strongly doubt that we'll ever get one, either a sequel to Dead Souls or a Kiwami-style remake would very likely be able to smooth out a lot of those rough spots and make this a genuine gem within the Yakuza series. If you're a huge Yakuza fan and happen to still have a working PS3 lying around, I would seriously recommend that you give this one a shot. It's far from the best the series has produced, but it's easily one of the most unique titles in the franchise, and has a lot of things that make it a worthwhile experience despite its flaws. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Yakuza Dead Souls a 7.1. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of a particularly long Yakuza video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, consider doing all those typical things that help to boost the video in the algorithm, and maybe even check out my channel memberships or my Patreon if you want to help support the channel financially. The support that you guys give makes an incredible difference here on the channel, and I'm more than thankful for every bit that I've received so far. But with all that being said, I'm going to get back to working on the next video, so once again, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.